At my brother's funeral, my sister-in-law slapped my 7-year-old nephew and called him garbage. The sound of her palm hitting his cheek was like a gunshot in the silent room. Everyone froze. Welcome to Revenge with Tian, so settle in. Get comfortable. Because in these stories, people always have a choice, and when they choose wrong, life answers back. Drop a comment and don't forget to subscribe. You will like it here. The air in the funeral home became heavy and cold. My nephew, Miles, didn't even cry at first. He just stood there, his small hand reaching up to touch his burning skin, his eyes wide with a mix of shock and pure terror. He was already grieving the loss of his father, my brother Ariel, and now he was being assaulted by the woman who was supposed to protect him. Victoria didn't look sorry at all. She stood over him, her face twisted in a mask of pure hatred. "Stop that pathetic noise," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "You are embarrassing my image in front of everyone who matters." She looked around the room, making sure the wealthy guests saw her, disciplining the child. I felt a surge of rage so hot it made my vision blur at the edges. This wasn't just a slap, it was a declaration of war. In that moment, the grief for my brother shifted into something much sharper. Victoria thought she was the queen of this domain. She had no idea she was standing on a trapdoor I was about to trigger. I am Myla Blakes, and I am 32 years old. Until that very second, I was just the quiet younger sister who stayed in the background. I lived in a modest apartment, drove an older car, and worked a tech job that Victoria always mocked. She used to tell people I was a charity case that my brother, Ariel, felt sorry for. She thought I was a nobody who relied on Ariel's success to survive. She was so wrong. Ariel and I didn't just share a last name, we shared a kingdom that we built from nothing in our early 20s. We had a pact. He would be the public face of the company, the charismatic CEO, while I would be the silent architect, the majority shareholder who controlled the blueprints and the deep tech. To the world, Ariel was the king. To the company, I was the power behind the throne. Victoria married the king, but she never bothered to look at the shadow behind him. She saw my simple clothes and my quiet nature as signs of weakness. She believed that with Ariel gone, she would inherit everything and sweep me away like dust. She didn't realize that I didn't just work in tech, I owned the very platform her entire social life was built upon. The Sterlings, Victoria's family, sat in the front row like they were attending a coronation rather than a funeral. They were dressed in designer black, looking down their noses at everyone. They had spent years treating me like a nuisance. Whenever we had family dinners, they would talk over me or ask me to run errands for them, as if I were the help. They believed they were the elite, and they viewed my brother's wealth as their personal ATM. Victoria's mother, a cold woman who smelled of expensive perfume and arrogance, leaned over and whispered loud enough for me to hear that Miles was always a difficult brat, and that Ariel had spoiled the boy too much. They didn't have a single tear for the man who had funded their lavish lifestyle for the past 6 years. To them, Ariel was just a bank account that had unfortunately closed, and they were already looking for the keys to the vault. They saw Miles as a burden, a loose end that needed to be managed or discarded. They had no idea that the charity case sister they ignored actually held the legal documents that could turn their entire world into a pile of ash. I watched them, my heart like a stone, recording every insult. The grief of losing Ariel was a physical weight in my chest. He was my best friend, my partner, and the only person who truly understood the pressure of what we had built. We grew up with nothing, and we promised each other we would never let our family struggle again. Seeing Miles' tiny handprint on his pale face broke something inside me. The poor boy was already suffocating under the weight of losing his dad, and now he was being publicly humiliated by his own mother. Victoria wasn't mourning a husband, she was performing for a crowd. She had spent the last hour checking her makeup in the reflection of the casket. The cruelty of the Sterlings was breathtaking. They were already discussing which of Ariel's cars they wanted to claim and which vacation homes they would frequent. Each layer of their disrespect deepened my emotional investment in their total destruction. By the time the service ended, I wasn't just a grieving sister anymore. I was a hunter. I looked at Miles, who was now trembling against my side, and I made a silent vow to my brother. I would protect his son, and I would make sure these people regretted the day they ever heard the name Blakes. At the wake, held in the massive mansion Ariel had bought, Victoria decided to make her move. She stood in the center of the grand foyer, surrounded by her wealthy friends and the local press. With a smug smile, she announced that she was selling the childhood home Ariel and I had grown up in, the house our parents had left to us, which Ariel had painstakingly restored. She claimed she was doing it to fund the Victoria Sterling Foundation for the Arts. It was a lie, she just wanted the cash. Then she turned to me in front of everyone. "Myla, dear, I'm sure you understand that we need to move on. I'll give you 30 days to clear out your brother's old junk and find a new place to stay. I can have the help lingering around while I renovate." The room went silent. People looked at me with pity, thinking I was being evicted and left homeless by my brother's widow. Victoria's mother chuckled into her champagne glass. They were enjoying my public humiliation, treating my life like a minor inconvenience they were finally cleaning up. They truly believed I was powerless, a girl with no resources and nowhere to go. They didn't notice that I wasn't shaking. I was perfectly still. I didn't cry, I didn't scream or make a scene. I walked slowly toward Victoria, the heels of my shoes clicking sharply on the marble floor. The crowd parted for me. When I was inches away from her, I looked her dead in the eye. I could see the triumph in her gaze, the belief that she had finally broken me. I didn't look like a victim. I looked like a mirror reflecting her own ugliness back at her. "Are you quite finished, Victoria?" I asked, my voice calm and ice-cold. She laughed, a high-pitched, mocking sound. "Oh, Myla, don't try to be brave. It's pathetic. Go find a lawyer you can actually afford, though I doubt any would take a case for a tech support girl. Maybe you can find a nice shelter." She turned back to her friends, dismissing me as if I were a fly. I didn't look away. I felt the shift in my soul. The grief was still there, but it was now fueled by a cold, clinical force. I moved from the grieving sister to a controlled force of nature. I knew something she didn't. I knew that every word she just spoke was being recorded, and every action she took was a nail in her financial coffin. "I'll do exactly that," I whispered. I stepped outside into the cool night air, the sounds of the party fading behind me. I took a deep breath and pulled my phone from my pocket. I dialed a private number that I hadn't called in 5 years, the direct line to our lead global counsel. "It's Myla," I said when he picked up. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "Miss Blakes? We've been waiting for your call." I looked back at the mansion, at the lights and the people who thought they owned the world. "Execute the sunset clause on all Sterling-held properties and assets immediately," I commanded. "And I want the forensic auditors on site by dawn. I want a full sweep of the estate and every account tied to my brother's name. If a single penny moved without my signature, I want to know where it went." There was a pause, then the lawyer's voice came back, firm and professional. "Consider it done. We've had the files ready since the news of Ariel's passing. It will take 2 hours to freeze the secondary tiers." This was the curiosity engine. I was calling in the wolves. Victoria had a 2-hour window of victory left before her entire reality began to crumble. For the next few hours, I played the waiting game. It was a strategic silence. I quietly gathered Miles and his small suitcase, moving him into my home without a word to Victoria. She sent me a flurry of smug text messages, mocking my sudden departure and telling me that she would leave my brother's things on the curb if I didn't hurry. She even sent a photo of herself drinking Julian's favorite vintage wine, celebrating her new beginning. She thought she had won because she held the keys to the mansion and the title to the cars. She had no idea that I owned the land the mansion sat on, the company that manufactured the cars, and the bank that held her mortgage. I let her feel superior. I let her and her family believe they were safe. It created a delicious emotional setup. The audience, the people at the party, the lawyers, the Sterlings, all thought I was a defeated woman. They didn't know a storm was coming. I sat in my darkened living room watching the clock. I knew that at exactly 2 a.m., the first domino would fall. The characters in her world were asleep, dreaming of wealth they no longer possessed. The first crack appeared the next morning. Victoria and her mother went to an ultra-exclusive brunch spot to celebrate their freedom. When the bill came, a staggering amount for caviar and champagne, Victoria handed over her black titanium card with a flourish. The waiter returned a moment later, looking uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Blakes, but the card has been declined." Victoria scoffed, telling him to try again, but it failed. She tried her secondary cards, her mother's cards, even her emergency lines. All of them were dead. Panic started to set in. She called me, screaming into the phone that there was a massive glitch in Ariel's accounts and that I needed to fix it immediately because she was being embarrassed in public. I listened to her frantic breathing for a moment before answering. "Maybe it's not a glitch, Victoria," I said, my voice smooth and untroubled. "Maybe it's a correction. Assets tend to freeze when they are under investigation for unauthorized use." She shrieked that she was the wife and had every right to the money. I simply hung up. The glitch was just the beginning. Her world was starting to bleed, and she had no bandages big enough to stop it. Later that day, Victoria's lawyers called for an emergency meeting at their high-end firm. They wanted to settle my inheritance and force me to sign away any remaining rights to Ariel's estate for a small lump sum. They thought they could bully me into submission. I arrived 20 minutes late. I wasn't alone. I walked in with a team of 4 elite world-class attorneys, the kind of lawyers who don't even list their names on a website because they only represent the top 0.1%. The look on Victoria's face when my team walked in was priceless. She was sitting there with her local lawyer, looking like she was ready to deliver a final blow. When she saw my counsel, her jaw literally dropped. They didn't sit on her side of the table. They sat with me. My lead attorney, a man who had dismantled Fortune 500 companies, didn't even look at her. He just opened a sleek leather folder and laid out a series of documents that changed the entire atmosphere of the room. The air left the room. Victoria's lawyer started sweating. They realized in that instant that they weren't dealing with a grieving sister. They were dealing with the majority shareholder of Blakes Industries. My attorney began to read the Miller-Jacob Trust documents. He explained, in a voice as cold as a winter morning, that Ariel didn't actually own the company in his own name. We had built a complex structure years ago to protect the legacy. We owned it as a partnership, 60-40, with me holding the 60%. But there was a specific legacy clause we had added after Miles was born. It stated that in the event of Ariel's death, full management and voting control of all shared assets would revert immediately to me. This was designed to protect Ariel's heir, Miles, from anyone who might try to exploit his inheritance. Victoria's marriage contract had a very specific limitation. She was entitled to a share of Ariel's personal income, but she had zero claim to the corporate assets or the trust. The king she thought she married was actually a trustee for his son's future, and I was the enforcer of that trust. The Sterling's lifestyle, the mansion, the private jets, the staff, were all corporate expenses authorized by the board, and as of midnight, the board, which I controlled, had revoked all of her privileges. "There is also the matter of conduct," my lawyer continued. I leaned forward and placed a tablet on the center of the mahogany table. I pressed play. The video was from the funeral home security cameras. It showed Victoria leaning down and slapping Miles. It showed his head snapping back and her cold, hateful expression. The audio was crystal clear. "Stop that pathetic noise. You're garbage." The room was deathly silent as the clip played on a loop. "This," I said, my voice echoing in the boardroom, "is clear evidence of child endangerment. It is also a direct violation of the moral turpitude clause in your marriage contract, Victoria. Engaging in public violence against your own child, especially during a time of mourning, constitutes a breach that nullifies your discretionary spending allowance." Victoria's face went from pale to a sickly, translucent color. Her lawyer tried to stammer out an excuse about stress and parental discipline, but my team shut him down instantly. We had the medical report from Miles's pediatrician as well. We had documented the bruising. She hadn't just lost the money, she had just handed me the weapon to take everything else. I didn't stop there. I handed Victoria a bright red folder. "This is a 24-hour notice of eviction," I told her. She started to scream that she was the mistress of the house, but I shook my head. The house is owned by the Blakes Holding Company. Since you announced a foundation that was never authorized by the majority shareholder, and since you've been using corporate funds for personal gain without approval, the house is being locked down for a full federal audit. Every piece of jewelry, every designer bag, and every piece of furniture in that house will be cataloged. If anything is missing, it will be considered theft from the estate. Victoria was shaking so hard she couldn't even speak. Her mother, who had tagged along, started to wail about their social standing. I didn't care. I was the one who was evicting her. I was the one who was taking back the keys. The power flip was complete. She had tried to give me 30 days to leave a house she didn't own. I was giving her 24 hours to leave a life she didn't deserve. Justice was being served, and it was ice cold. The next morning, the begging began. My phone was flooded with calls from Victoria and her mother. They weren't screaming anymore, they were sobbing. Victoria's mother called me, her voice trembling as she talked about family and how we all make mistakes when we are grieving. She begged me not to throw them out on the street. I reminded her of what she had whispered at the funeral, how Miles was a brat and how Ariel had spoiled him. I'm just following your lead, I told her. You said the boy was a burden. I'm just making sure he isn't burdened by people like you anymore. I hung up. The silence that followed was the most satisfying sound I had heard since Ariel died. I could imagine them frantically packing, trying to hide expensive items in their suitcases, only to be stopped by the security team I had stationed at every exit. I felt no pity. They had shown no mercy to a grieving child, so they would receive none from me. The charity case was now the gatekeeper, and the gate was firmly shut. I went to the kitchen and made Miles pancakes, finally feeling a sense of peace. The forensic auditors worked through the night, and what they found was even worse than I had imagined. Victoria hadn't just been spending Ariel's money, she had been systematically funneling massive amounts out of his private accounts for months before his sudden illness. She had been preparing for a life without him long before he was gone. She had hidden accounts in offshore shells and had been selling off some of his private collections behind his back. This wasn't just a civil dispute over an inheritance anymore. This was a criminal matter. We found evidence of wire fraud and embezzlement. When my lawyer showed me the numbers, I felt a new wave of cold fury. She had been stealing from her husband while he was still alive and breathing. She had been plotting her foundation with stolen funds. I realized then that Victoria never loved Ariel. She only loved the access he provided. This discovery changed the game. I wasn't just going to take her money, I was going to make sure she faced a judge. The grieving widow was about to become a defendant. The timeline of her betrayal was now laid bare. I decided to let the truth out. I didn't go to the tabloids myself, but my team ensured the audit findings were made available to the right people. Within hours, the local papers and social media were buzzing. The grieving widow who had been so vocal about her charity work was now being labeled as the embezzling socialite. Her foundation was dissolved by the state before it even had a chance to launch. People who had been at the funeral, people who had watched her slap Miles, started coming forward with their own stories of her cruelty. The public perception flipped overnight. She was no longer the victim of a tragic loss, she was the villain of a corporate scandal. Her wealthy friends, the ones who had laughed at me, suddenly deleted her from their contacts. They didn't want to be associated with a woman under federal investigation. I watched from my home as her world burned. She was losing her status, her reputation, and her freedom all at once. It was a rapid, public fall, and she had no one to blame but herself. She had built her house on a foundation of lies and theft. Victoria's legal team reached out with a desperate offer. They suggested a settlement, where Victoria would sign over all claims to the estate, give up her marital portion, and leave the state forever if I would agree to drop the criminal charges and the audit. She was terrified of prison. My lawyers looked at me, waiting for my reaction. For a second, I almost agreed. I wanted this to be over. I wanted to focus on Miles and our healing. The audience might have thought this was the end, the part where the hero shows mercy and everyone moves on. Victoria certainly thought so. She even sent me a long, fake apology email, talking about how confused she had been and how much she truly loved Ariel. But I looked at Miles, who still flinched whenever someone moved their hand too quickly near him, and I remembered that slap. I remembered her calling him garbage. I realized that a woman like Victoria doesn't change. She just pivots to survive. I wasn't done yet. There was more to this story that even Victoria didn't know I had discovered. Just as Victoria thought she was about to escape with a settlement, I called her back to the boardroom for one final meeting. She walked in looking hopeful, thinking she had manipulated me into a deal. I let her sit there for a minute before I spoke. "The settlement is off the table, Victoria," I said, her face twisted in shock. "But why? I'm giving you everything." I leaned forward. "Because we discovered where that embezzled money went. It didn't just go to your designer bags. You were funneling it into a trust for yourself, using Miles's social security number as a tax shield. You were stealing from your own son's college fund." Her eyes went wide. She hadn't realized we had tracked the minor's trust accounts. "Because you involved a minor's legal identity in your fraud, this is no longer a private matter I can settle. The state's attorney general has already opened a file. I can't drop the charges even if I wanted to. You've triggered a mandatory prosecution." This was the first twist. She had thought she was safe, but she had dug a hole so deep she couldn't see the light. The second twist came shortly after. Victoria's father, the man who had looked down on me for years, tried to intervene. He came to my office demanding that I have respect for their family name. He threatened to use his business influence to ruin me. I simply handed him a set of debt acquisition papers. "Mr. Sterling," I said, "your company has been struggling for years. You've been surviving on high-interest loans to keep up appearances. What you didn't know is that my brother Ariel had been buying up that debt through various subsidiaries to keep you afloat for Victoria's sake." He looked at the papers, his face turning a deep shade of purple. "As of this morning, I have consolidated all those loans under my personal name. Your business, your home, and your family's entire legacy are now financially tethered to my whim. If you take one step against me or Miles, I will call in the debt and liquidate everything you own within 48 hours. He collapsed into a chair, his arrogance completely drained. The elite Sterlings were now effectively my employees. They weren't just broke, they were owned. The third twist was the most emotional one. While clearing out Ariel's private safe deposit box, I found a letter he had written only a week before he passed. It was addressed to me. In it, Ariel revealed that he had found out about Victoria's affairs and her financial betrayals. He had already signed the initial divorce papers and was planning to serve her the day after the charity gala he never made it to. He had known for months that his marriage was a sham. He had stayed just long enough to ensure Miles was legally protected. He wrote, "Myla, if something happens to me, don't let her take a single brick of what we built. She isn't a Blakes. She's a ghost in our house." This meant that the grieving widow was actually about to be a broke divorcee, regardless of his death. Her entire claim to being a wife in good standing was a lie. I had the signed papers in my hand. This was the ultimate validation. Ariel hadn't been a victim of her charms at the end. He had been her judge. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I wasn't just taking her down for me. I was finishing what my brother started. The fourth twist happened during the deposition for the criminal case. Victoria tried to pin the embezzlement on her assistant, claiming she was a victim of bad accounting. She thought she could sacrifice someone else to save herself. But her best friend and socialite accomplice, a woman who had helped her hide the money, realized that Victoria was going to throw her under the bus too. To save herself from prison, the friend turned on Victoria. She provided my team with a series of encrypted messages and voice notes. In one particularly chilling recording, Victoria was heard laughing about how she was going to ship Miles off to a strict boarding school in another country the moment the will was read, so she wouldn't have to look at Ariel's annoying brat anymore. Hearing her voice talk about discarding a child like a piece of trash was the final nail in her coffin. The jury, and the public, now had proof that she was not just a thief, but a monster. Her plan to isolate Myles was now her own undoing. The fifth twist involved the Sterlings' ancestral vacation home. The one place Victoria thought she could retreat to after the mansion was seized. She tried to list it for sale secretly to fund an escape to a non-extradition country. She thought that since it was in her family name, I couldn't touch it. However, when her realtor did a title search, they found a shock. 3 years ago, when the Sterlings were about to lose that house to taxes, Ariel had bought it through a shell company to save it for Victoria, intending to give it back to her as an anniversary gift once she changed her ways. He never gave it to her because she never changed. The title was held by Blakes Industries. It was never hers to sell. She was trying to sell a house that I owned. When she found out, she reportedly had a breakdown in the realtor's office, screaming that I was haunting her. It wasn't a haunting, it was just the reality of a world she had tried to steal from. Every safe place she had left was actually a room I held the keys to. The sixth and final twist was the custody battle. Victoria tried one last, desperate move. She threatened to launch a messy, public custody fight for Myles, claiming I was alienating him from his mother. She thought she could use the boy as a bargaining chip to get the criminal charges dropped. "Give me the money, or I'll make sure you never see him again," she threatened in a leaked voicemail. I didn't even flinch. I walked into court and presented the recordings I had been making for a year, not of the slap, but of her verbal abuse of Myles at home. I had installed a security system in the house for Ariel's protection, and it had captured everything. Her screaming at him for crying, her ignoring him for days, and her telling him he was the reason his father was stressed. The judge was horrified. Not only did she lose custody, but she was also stripped of all parental rights. I was granted full legal guardianship of Myles. Her final weapon had turned into a self-inflicted wound. She was now truly alone, with no family, no money, and no leverage. The downfall was absolute. Victoria was led out of the courthouse in handcuffs, sentenced to several years for fraud and embezzlement. Her parents were forced to move out of their estate and into a tiny, 2-bedroom rental apartment in a part of town they used to mock. They were no longer the elite. They were just people struggling to pay their bills, their reputations destroyed forever. I stood on the porch of our childhood home, the house I had saved from her sale, holding Myles's hand. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the garden Ariel loved. Myles looked up at me, his eyes clear and no longer filled with fear. "She can't hurt us anymore, can she, Auntie Myla?" he asked quietly. I squeezed his hand and leaned down. "Never again, Myles. We're home and we're safe." The satisfaction was overwhelming. I had taken a family of predators and dismantled them with the very systems they tried to exploit. The emotional payoff was the sight of Myles finally smiling as he ran toward his old swing set. The villains didn't just lose, they were erased from our lives. I didn't just keep the wealth for myself. I used the money Victoria had tried to steal to create the Ariel Blakes Memorial Fund, a foundation that actually helped children who had lost parents or faced abuse. It became one of the most respected charities in the country. I remained the silent architect of Blakes Industries, but I was no longer hiding. I was the guardian of a legacy. The final shot of our story would be me and Myles at the park, playing under the trees Ariel had planted. I was no longer the quiet sister or the charity case. I was the woman who had protected her family. And as for the funeral home where it all began, I bought the entire company and turned it into a community center for families in need. Every time Victoria is transported to court for her remaining hearings, the van passes that center. She sees my name and Ariel's name in giant gold letters on the building she once thought was her stage. She just slapped the owner, and in doing so, she gave me the power to build something beautiful from the wreckage. Justice was served, and we were finally at peace. If you liked this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories.